Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget that feeling. It was the moment when everything changed. The moment I realized that evil isn't always something you can see. Sometimes it's something you feel, creeping into your skin, settling deep inside of you. It all started on an ordinary evening, like any other. I was sitting in my apartment, the lights dimmed, the hum of the city far below muffled by the thick walls. I was tired, drained from work, yet something felt off. It was the kind of discomfort that wasn't caused by anything you could pinpoint, but you knew it was there. Something hovering at the edge of your awareness. I stretched out on the couch, trying to shake off the sense that I was being watched. That strange feeling had been following me for days, getting stronger with every passing hour. It wasn't until I closed my eyes that I felt it, the first brush against my skin. It started as a gentle sensation, like the brush of a finger across my neck. My body tensed immediately, but when I opened my eyes, there was nothing there. Nothing but the quiet apartment and the low hum of the fridge in the corner. Just my imagination, I told myself. But it wasn't. I felt it again, this time on the back of my hand. A cold, almost imperceptible touch, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. My skin prickled, and a sudden wave of nausea washed over me. I jerked my hand back, glancing around the room, but nothing had changed. It was the same old living room, with its worn carpet and faded curtains. Yet, it felt different. The air felt heavier, thick with something I couldn't explain. I stood up, pacing around the small space. The feeling lingered, hovering just out of reach like a shadow, something I couldn't see but knew was there. I shook my head, trying to shake off the anxiety tightening around my chest. It had to be stress, right? Or maybe I was just imagining things. But then, I heard it. A faint scraping sound. It came from the direction of the hallway. Soft at first, but it grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like nails dragging against the floor, scraping slowly, methodically. I froze. No one else lived in the apartment. I had checked multiple times. I was completely alone. Yet, there it was. The sound. Getting closer. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself that it was just a building settling, or maybe a rat in the walls. But my feet felt glued to the floor, my body unwilling to move. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I slowly turned toward the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was dark, the shadows stretching long across the walls. Nothing seemed out of place, but something was wrong. The air was too still, too thick. I reached out, my hand trembling as I pressed it against the wall. The coldness that radiated from the surface sent a shiver through me. It wasn't just the temperature that made my skin crawl, it was the sensation of something else beneath it. Something that shouldn't be there. I moved down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The scraping sound grew louder. Closer. It was almost as if it was coming from the walls themselves, scratching and scraping, as though the very building was alive, trying to reach out. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I had to find the source of the sound. I had to know. The hallway ended at my bedroom door. The the door that I always kept closed, out of habit. But now, it felt different. It felt like the door was waiting for me to open it. Without thinking, I reached for the knob. The instant my fingers touched it, the air around me seemed to freeze. The temperature dropped so sharply that I could see my breath in the dim light. I pulled my hand away, confused and terrified. My heart was racing, and my breath came in short, shallow gasps. Something was wrong. I looked around. The hallway, the room, everything felt darker. The shadows seemed to move, stretching in unnatural ways, as if they were alive. The light from the living room barely made it down the hall, leaving the edges of the space bathed in inky blackness. And then I felt it again. A pressure on my skin, colder than before. Someone was behind me. I turned, but nothing was there. Nothing except the oppressive silence, broken only by the soft, rhythmic scraping from the walls. My fingers brushed my neck again, and I froze. This time, the touch was more deliberate, colder, as if something was pressing against me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I backed away from the door, stumbling, my legs weak beneath me. The darkness at the end of the hall seemed to grow thicker, the air heavier. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, to get out. But my feet wouldn't move. Then, the voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but clear as day. You can feel me, can't you? I wanted to scream, to run, but my body betrayed me. The darkness, the pressure, it was all consuming. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stand there, helpless, as the darkness wrapped around me, seeping into my skin. You're mine now. And then, the touch was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in the hall. But when I finally managed to move, everything seemed different. The air was lighter, but the dread still clung to me like a second skin. I didn't dare open the door. I couldn't. Not yet. I had to get away from it. From whatever had touched me. But it was already too late. The darkness had already marked me. And now it would follow me until I could no longer escape. The question remained, how much of it was real? It was the kind of silence that suffocated you. The kind that pressed down on your chest until your breath came in short gasps. I kept telling myself that I had to leave, that I couldn't stay in this apartment a minute longer. The weight of the night, the sensation of that cold, invisible hand, was too much. But I didn't move. I couldn't. I was still standing in the dark hallway, the dim light from the living room stretching just far enough to cast long shadows across the floor. The scraping sound was gone now, but the silence felt just as menacing. My skin still tingled, as though I could feel it, the presence that had brushed against me, the invisible weight that pressed down from all around. I turned and looked down the hallway. The door to my bedroom was still there, like a black mouth ready to swallow me whole. It had to be the source of whatever this was. I knew it, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Instead, I backed away, one step at a time, my legs trembling beneath me. The cold air seemed to cling to my skin, even though I hadn't moved from the same spot. As I moved into the living room, I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, pounding like a drum. It was all I could hear. My mind raced in frantic circles, trying to make sense of everything. It wasn't real. It wasn't real, I repeated, but even as the words left my lips, I knew I didn't believe them. I reached for my phone. Maybe I could call someone. talk to someone, anything to break this suffocating silence. But as soon as I unlocked the screen, I froze. There was a message. I'm still here. The text was simple, but it chilled me to the bone. I didn't recognize the number. I stared at it for a long time. My fingers hovered over the screen, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I didn't even know what I would say. What could I say to that? The darkness felt closer now, as though it had crept into the very walls of my apartment. The air was thick, heavy, oppressive. I couldn't breathe properly. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my head spinning, my stomach churning. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. With shaking hands, I grabbed my jacket from the back of the couch and hurried to the door. I didn't even bother to lock it behind me. I just needed to get out. But as soon as I stepped outside, I was met with an eerie stillness. The street, normally bustling with people and cars, was empty. Not a single soul in sight. The streetlights flickered above, casting long, wavering shadows across the pavement. It's just late, I tried to convince myself. It's probably just late and everyone's asleep. But the unease that had gripped me in my apartment was still there, following me like a shadow. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I looked down the street. The night felt oppressive, suffocating, as though the very air had turned against me. I started walking, my footsteps echoing far too loudly in the silence. But the more I walked, the more I felt like something was wrong. It wasn't the emptiness of the street. It wasn't even the silence. It was the feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake it. The sensation of invisible eyes on my back, following me with every step. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something there, but there was nothing. No one. Just the street, empty and cold. Then I felt it again. That prickling sensation, like fingers tracing the back of my neck. I stopped dead in my tracks. It can't be. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I spun around, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. But again, nothing. Nothing but the sound of my own breath, ragged and shallow. Then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the very end of the street, near the alley where the streetlights barely reached, I saw a figure standing in the darkness. It was nothing more than a shadow at first, blending into the night, but as I watched, it moved. It wasn't human, at least, not in the way I understood. The figure seemed to ripple, its form distorting, as though it was made of the very darkness itself. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if my legs were frozen, my mind paralyzed by the sight before me. The figure tilted its head, and for a brief moment, I could see something in the darkness, two glowing eyes, fixed on me. Then, it stepped forward. And that was enough. My feet finally obeyed, and I turned, running as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound of my own panicked breaths was all I could hear as I raced down the street, the weight of something chasing me pressing on my back. I didn't stop until I reached the corner, breathless and shaking. I pressed my back against the cold brick of the nearest building, trying to calm my frantic pulse. But the feeling wouldn't leave. The presence. The touch. The dark figure with the glowing eyes. I wanted to believe it was all just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. Whatever it was real. And it wasn't done with me yet. I pulled out my phone again, my fingers trembling as I tried to type something. Anything. But then another message came through. You're not alone. My heart stopped. I stood there, staring at the screen, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The message was simple, yet the implications were horrifying. You're not alone. The words felt like a trap, each letter seeping into my mind like poison. I could almost hear a voice whispering them, soft but insistent, as if it had been waiting for me to read it. The coldness that had settled in my chest spread, twisting my insides with dread. How could anyone know what I was feeling? How could they know I had just seen? I glanced over my shoulder, as though expecting the figure to be right behind me, its presence creeping ever closer. The street was still empty, silent. There was no one around. Just the distant hum of the city, but that, too, felt distant now. Hollow. Far away. I began to walk again, my steps slow and deliberate, my mind racing. Where could I go? What could I do? My apartment was an impossibility now, if it was even real anymore. The darkness, that thing I'd felt in the hallway, the strange touch, it was all part of something larger. Something I didn't understand, but couldn't ignore. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, as though the fabric could protect me from whatever was out there, stalking me. But it didn't help. Nothing helped. Every shadow seemed to stretch further, every flicker of light seemed to hide something just out of sight. I was trapped in this suffocating silence, and my own thoughts were my only company. I reached the edge of the street, where the city faded into darker, quieter areas. This part of town wasn't the best, dimly lit alleys, old buildings with crumbling walls, and abandoned storefronts. It had always been a place I'd avoided. But now it felt like the safest option, the only place where I could breathe without that feeling of being watched, hunted. I found a bench under a flickering streetlight and sat down. My hands rested on my knees, palms open, as if willing the trembling to stop. I couldn't seem to get a grip on myself, couldn't shake the feeling of something being just behind me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to falter. The screen of my phone blinked in my hands. The next message. Don't turn around. A chill ran through me, colder than the night air. I hadn't turned around, yet. I couldn't. I didn't want to. But the message was clear. It was a warning. A command. And the urge to obey it was overwhelming. I knew what would happen if I looked. But even more than that, I knew something far worse. I already felt it. I had been feeling it all along, ever since I first left my apartment. The presence that had been lingering just out of sight, the one that hadn't left, was closer now. I didn't need to look to know it was there. I could feel it, right behind me. The bench creaked under my weight as I shifted, the cool air biting at my skin. The shadows around me felt like they were closing in. I dared not glance back. I didn't have to. The air around me thickened, heavy with something far darker than the usual night. It felt wrong, like the very fabric of the world was twisting, bending under pressure. My heartbeat quickened, and I swore I heard something move in the darkness, something far too big to be just the wind. I clenched my fists. My breath was shallow. Just breathe. Just breathe. The message came again, this time more urgent. It's right behind you. I froze. My entire body went stiff, as though every muscle was holding its breath. The words hit me like a physical blow. How could they know? How could they feel what I was feeling? But it didn't matter. The presence was there. I could feel it now. The prickling sensation on the back of my neck grew sharper this time. I knew it was no longer just a thought. The air around me had become thick and heavy with something far worse than fear. The darkness, that darkness I had felt so many times before, was taking form. The shape was there, out of the corner of my eye. Too faint to see clearly, but I could feel it, sharp, unyielding, crawling closer. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body had betrayed me. My limbs were frozen, unable to obey my mind's frantic pleas. Don't turn around. I heard the message in my head, and it felt like a warning, but also an order. There was no escape. It was already here. The sensation of cold fingers brushed against my skin. I gasped, instinctively jerking away, but the touch didn't leave. It lingered, a chilling pressure on my shoulder. My heart raced, but I couldn't bring myself to scream. The touch, though intangible, felt so real. So wrong. Don't turn around. I couldn't. I knew I couldn't. But as I sat there, my breath erratic and shallow, I felt something begin to shift in the air. The shadows around me seemed to grow darker, thicker, as if they were folding in on themselves, collapsing toward me. The world felt like it was being consumed by something beyond my understanding. Then, a voice. It wasn't clear at first, but it grew louder as if something was trying to speak through the oppressive quiet. It was like a whisper, but deeper, more resonant. It's time. The words echoed in my head, drowning out everything else. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, just as quickly as it came, the sensation was gone. The shadows receded. The pressure lifted. The night air was once again just air. I dared to open my eyes. I turned slowly, my body trembling, dreading what I might see. But there was nothing. Only the empty street. The dim streetlights flickering overhead. Stillness. It was gone. But that voice, those words, they still echoed in my head. And deep down, I knew. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. I stumbled back from the bench, my legs unsteady as if the earth beneath me had become something unfamiliar. The chill of the night air bit deeper into my skin, but it wasn't just the cold anymore. Something had changed, deep inside, something had shifted. The terror I just felt was still alive within me, its presence hanging like a fog I couldn't shake off. The world around me seemed muted now, the quiet so thick it was almost suffocating. The shadows from the buildings cast long, uneven stretches across the pavement, as if they were alive, stretching and contracting like breathing creatures. My heart was still hammering in my chest, each beat like a drum pounding a rhythm of fear. I kept telling myself it was just a momentary panic, a glitch in my mind, but deep down, I knew the truth. It had touched me. It had been real. I forced myself to walk, though each step felt like it took more effort than the last. The street ahead was still eerily silent, the usual sounds of the city, distant chatter, car engines, the hum of electricity, felt like they belonged to another world. Everything seemed dimmer, more distant, as though I were walking through a dream. I reached for my phone, hoping for some kind of distraction, but the screen flickered before lighting up with an incoming message. You can't run. It knows where you are. I froze mid-step, the words sinking in like a stone in my stomach. The air around me felt even heavier, suffocating in its stillness. I looked around quickly, but no one was in sight. The street was completely empty. The streetlights above flickered once more, their light too dim to reassure me, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally. I stumbled to the nearest alley, hoping the darkness there might offer some reprieve. The alley was narrow and lined with old, decaying buildings. The smell of dampness, old brick, and rusted metal filled the air. It was the kind of place I'd once avoided, but now it seemed like the only place where I could hide from whatever was following me. I leaned against the cold stone wall, the phone still gripped tightly in my shaking hands. The screen blinked again, a new message appearing. It's already inside your mind. The words froze me in place. Inside my mind? How could it be inside my mind? How could anything be that close? I closed my eyes, pressing my palms to my temples, trying to block out the sensation that something was crawling beneath my skin. I could almost feel it, that prickling presence, creeping just under the surface. Like dark fingers sliding along my thoughts, twisting them. The air in the alley suddenly thickened, and I could feel the temperature drop even more, the cold biting through my jacket. My breath came out in invisible clouds. And then, as though it had been waiting for me to notice, I heard it. A soft, scraping sound, like nails against stone. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but as it grew louder, I realized with horror that it was moving closer. I turned, heart pounding, but the alley was still empty. Only the faint scrape of something against the ground filled the silence. My hand shot out, pressing against the wall for support as my legs trembled beneath me. My mind screamed for me to move, to run, but I couldn't. My feet felt glued to the ground, my body locked in place. The scraping sound continued, growing louder, sharper. It was coming from behind me, from within the walls themselves. I turned around quickly, eyes darting in every direction, trying to find the source of the noise. But there was nothing. Just the endless shadows stretching around me, wrapping me in their darkness. I tried to take a deep breath, but it caught in my throat. The sensation that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me, was overwhelming. I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls themselves were closing in, pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then, a voice. Soft, like a whisper, but somehow clearer than anything I'd ever heard. It's too late now. The words reverberated in my skull, filling my entire being with a cold, paralyzing dread. My body stiffened, and I knew with a sickening certainty that whatever it was, whatever had been toying with me, it wasn't just in my head anymore. It was here. I stumbled backwards, my heart racing faster than it ever had before. The air was thick now, as if something else was filling the space around me, something ancient and suffocating. The darkness seemed to grow and writhe, shifting in ways that were not possible. A cold shadow passed over me, brushing against my face, as if it had been there all along, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. My body refused to respond to my frantic thoughts. Suddenly, I felt it again, the unmistakable sensation of fingers brushing against my skin, cold and unyielding. This time, it was on my neck, the pressure of them lingering for a heartbeat longer than any human touch could. The dark presence, the thing that had followed me, was close enough now to touch. I screamed, the sound strangled and broken, but the walls around me seemed to swallow it whole, as if even my fear was being consumed by the darkness. The whisper came again, closer this time, its voice impossibly low. It knows everything about you. It's already inside. I felt my heart lurch in my chest, the weight of the words pressing down on me. Inside? What did that mean? What did it want? And then, with an unnatural creak, the wall behind me shifted. I gasped and turned, only to find the stone itself warping, bending inward as though something were coming out from within. I could hear it, feel it, the scrape of something clawing its way through, the hiss of air, the shifting of reality itself. The shadows around me grew, almost like they had substance, like they were pulling together into something tangible, something alive. My breath caught in my throat, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of the horror. I was no longer just running from a shadow. I was running from myself. With every step, with every heartbeat, the dark thing was growing stronger, feeding off my fear, becoming more real. I didn't know how much longer I could stay ahead of it, how much longer I could survive whatever this thing was. But as the wall behind me finally gave way, I knew one thing for certain. It was no longer a question of if I would escape. It was a question of who would escape. I couldn't breathe. My lungs were burning with the effort of gasping for air, but no matter how hard I tried, the air felt thin, too thin. The darkness, once so distant, had now crept so close that I could feel its weight pressing on my chest, its fingers curling around my throat. The wall behind me had split open like a wound in the fabric of reality itself. The stone had cracked, pieces of it falling to the ground, and from within the jagged hole, I saw nothing. Only an abyss. The darkness there wasn't the absence of light, it was alive. It swirled, moved, and shifted as though it had a mind of its own, watching me. It wanted something, needed something, and that something, I feared, was me. I staggered back, but there was nowhere to go. The alley behind me, once a simple, familiar path, now twisted and stretched in impossible directions. The walls had begun to melt and warp, their surfaces rippling like water. The ground beneath my feet buckled and shifted. It felt as if the whole world was unraveling, the seams of reality itself coming undone. I could feel my heart beating in my ears, each pulse a reminder that time was running out. I tried to run, tried to escape, but the ground itself seemed to pull me back. My feet were stuck, the weight of my own fear keeping me rooted in place. I turned my head wildly, searching for an exit, for any sign of hope, but all I saw were shadows that moved unnaturally, shapes that lurked just out of sight, waiting for me to make a mistake. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat, choked by the suffocating pressure of the darkness closing in. And then, as if to answer my unspoken fear, the voice returned. Low. Cold. It's already too late. You belong to it now. The words echoed in my mind, curling around my thoughts like tendrils of smoke, suffocating me. Belong to it? No. I had no intention of belonging to anything, let alone this thing. But it was too late for defiance. My hands trembled as I reached for anything to defend myself, but there was nothing. Only the suffocating dark. I could feel it, crawling beneath my skin once more. The cold fingers of the thing were inside me now, worming through my veins, coiling around my heart. It was inescapable. Desperation surged through me. There had to be a way out, some way to break free. But my mind was a tangled mess of thoughts, fear clashing with logic. It knows everything about me. It's inside me now. That voice, that presence, had been whispering in my mind for so long that it felt like part of me. The shadows began to take form, pulling themselves from the walls. They were not human, not entirely, but they had shape. They had eyes. And they were all looking at me. I could feel their gaze, cold and unblinking. My body stiffened as the shadows inched closer, moving like liquid smoke, undulating and stretching in ways that defied the rules of physics. They reached for me, their movements slow and deliberate. I could see the edges of their forms, but it was the eyes, those endless black eyes that terrified me the most. They weren't eyes at all, but hollow pits of darkness that seemed to absorb everything they looked at, including my very soul. I backed up, heart hammering in my chest, but there was no escape. I was surrounded. The shadows were closing in, their presence overwhelming. And then, through the darkness, I saw it, the shape of something bigger, something more solid than the shadows. It was tall, too tall, its form hunched and twisted. Its face was a void, but there was a presence there, a cold malevolence that made my blood freeze. The thing moved, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath its steps. The darkness, once a swirling mass, now seemed to bow before it, following its every movement like a loyal servant. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare as it approached, its steps slow and deliberate. My body was frozen in place, as if the thing had rooted me to the spot with its mere presence. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. And then, as the thing towered over me, its shadow stretching across the entire alley, it whispered, "I've waited for you." The words cut through me, not just in my ears, but in my very bones. I could feel them, its words, wrapping around me, twisting through my mind like chains. It had always been waiting for me to slip, to break. And now it had me. I was lost. But then, just as the darkness seemed to consume me whole, a spark of defiance ignited deep inside me. A flicker of something human, something alive within the cold, hollow feeling that had taken over. I wasn't done yet. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I wrenched my body free from the grip of terror. I pushed forward, stumbling but refusing to fall, refusing to let the darkness swallow me. The shadows seemed to recoil, as if taken aback by my resistance. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was a start. And I would fight. I had to. The alleyway was still a maze of shifting walls and twisting shadows, but I didn't care. I ran. The air was thick and suffocating, but I pushed forward, my hands outstretched, feeling my way through the darkness. The shadows lurked behind me, their whispers clawing at my mind, but I refused to listen. I had to survive. And then, I saw it, a sliver of light. A crack in the oppressive dark, a narrow sliver of reality breaking through. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the edge of something solid. The wall. The alley. The world outside. With one final burst of energy, I shoved through, the light flooding my vision, blinding me for a moment. And just like that, I was free. But even as I stepped into the light, I knew that the darkness was still there. Waiting. Watching. It hadn't let me go. Not yet. I was still running. And this time, it wasn't just the alley I had to escape from. It was myself. Have you ever walked alone at night, feeling as though something is just behind you, watching, waiting? That was how I felt tonight, unsettled, anxious, but unable to resist the pull of the dark. The city had always been my refuge, its streets familiar, its sounds comforting, but tonight was different. There was an unfamiliar chill in the air, one that didn't belong to the coolness of the evening breeze. It was as if the night itself had drawn a breath and exhaled something cold, something that touched my skin in a way that made me shiver. I walked down the dimly lit streets of the old neighborhood, past the tall buildings with their cracked facades, where the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the concrete, an unnatural staccato that filled the air, amplifying my every movement. It felt like the world was holding its breath. And then, as I turned the corner, I heard it. At first, it was just a faint rustle, a shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet. I paused, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I looked around, but there was no one there. The street was empty, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of streetlights. The air was thick with silence, but the sound had remained. It wasn't coming from the alleyways or the shadows, it was behind me. I turned, my heart thudding in my chest. The street stretched out before me, the same as always, but somehow wrong. The shadows seemed deeper, darker than they should have been. The alleyways were no longer just dark spaces between buildings, they felt like they were opening up, pulling at the edges of the street, reaching for me. I took a step forward, then another, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the shuffling sound continued, closer now, like someone was trailing me. My breath quickened. I knew I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched crawled over my skin like 1,000 tiny spiders, each one leaving a mark of cold fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving in the dark, that it was waiting for me to make a mistake. I sped up, my footsteps quickening as I tried to outrun whatever followed. My mind raced, searching for a logical explanation, but there was nothing. No cars. No people. Just the sound of my own breathing, now heavy and shallow in my chest. And then, just as I thought I was imagining it, the sound changed. It wasn't just the shuffle of footsteps anymore, it was a soft whisper, too faint to catch, but they're all the same. It was calling my name. I froze. My blood ran cold as I realized that the voice had no warmth to it, no life. It was distant, hollow, like it came from deep within the earth itself, or worse, from somewhere just outside of reality. Come back. The whisper was soft but insistent, tugging at the edges of my sanity. It was impossible. No one was there. I turned around again, my eyes scanning the empty street, desperate for any sign of movement. There was nothing. But that voice, it lingered in the air, like a shadow that refused to leave. A cold breeze blew past me, and with it came the scent, old and musty, like something had been dead for a long time. It was the smell of decay, of something left to rot in the dark. I gagged, my throat closing as the odor filled my senses. Suddenly, the streetlight flickered. I flinched as it blinked out, leaving me in darkness for a brief moment. And when it came back on, the world had shifted. The street, once familiar, now felt alien, wrong. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They had shape. They moved. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind scrambling for anything that could explain what I was seeing. The shadows, no, not shadows, figures, were standing in the alleyways now, watching me, waiting. I could see their eyes. They were dark, empty, staring, and they didn't blink. I tried to run. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get away, needed to escape the feeling of being hunted. My legs felt heavy, each step harder than the last. The sound of my own breathing drowned out the noises around me, but I knew I wasn't alone. They were still there, just behind me, just out of sight. The figures began to move. I couldn't make out their shapes clearly, but I saw enough. Tall, unnaturally tall, their limbs too long, their bodies too thin. The shadows stretched across the street, curling like smoke, wrapping themselves around the buildings. And still, the whispering came, a voice too soft to make out, but the feeling of its words was clear. It was following me. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. But I could feel it, feel them, getting closer. In that moment, I knew something. Something deep inside. I wasn't walking alone. And I had never been. I was being followed by something that shouldn't exist. Something that was there in the dark, waiting. The night had come alive with a thirst I couldn't understand. And it wanted me. I ran faster than I had ever run before. My legs were burning with every step, my lungs desperate for air, but it wasn't enough. The whispers, that hollow, guttural voice, were still there, behind me, close enough now to feel like breath on my neck. I couldn't understand why I wasn't reaching the end of the street. The distance seemed endless, like the road stretched further with each step I took. The once familiar urban landscape began to distort around me. The buildings loomed higher, their windows dark and empty, like eyes staring down at me in judgment. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting long, unnatural shadows that reached out like grasping hands. Something wasn't right. The very air seemed thicker now, heavy with a presence that clung to me, suffocating me with its weight. The cold was deeper, sharper, like it had sunk into my bones. My heartbeat hammered in my chest, pounding so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. But I could still hear the whispers. They were everywhere. Soft at first, like a distant murmur, but now they were insistent, closer, as if they were moving with me, around me, in sync with my every breath. And then, as if they had always been there, I heard a voice, clear and sharp, unnaturally so. "You can't run." I froze in my tracks, my body trembling, my mind reeling. The voice, there was something about it, something that chilled me to the core. It wasn't just the sound that terrified me. It was the certainty in it. The calmness. It knew I was running. It knew everything. I turned around, my heart hammering in my throat. The street was still empty, still eerily silent, except for the flickering lights and the cold that gripped at my spine. But the shadows, they were moving. At first, I thought I saw them twitch, just a small movement at the edge of my vision. But then it was unmistakable. One of the figures stepped forward, its body long and sinewy, the shape almost too fluid, like it was made of darkness itself. The shadows clung to it, warping around it like a second skin. Its face, if it could be called that, was a blur of indistinct features, but its eyes, those hollow black pits, were fixed directly on me. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, strangled by the terror crawling up my spine. The figure took another step, and with it, the shadows stretched, creeping along the walls of the buildings, curling like smoke. And then, another voice, this time, from somewhere deeper in the dark, behind me, spoke again, as though it had been waiting for me to listen. "It's too late." I stumbled back, my mind racing for some way to escape, but there was nothing. No doors to run to, no alleyways to hide in. The street had become a labyrinth, a maze of darkened streets that closed in around me. The sounds of my own panic, my ragged breathing, echoed back at me, mocking me. Suddenly, there was movement in the corner of my eye, more shadows, shifting at the edges of the street, their forms more solid now. They weren't just specters anymore, they were real. They were coming closer, moving in jerky, unnatural motions, as if they didn't fully belong in this world. Their limbs twisted and contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I ran again, but this time my steps faltered. I was slowing down. I could feel it, the weight of something heavy pressing down on me. The air was thicker now, suffocating. My lungs burned, and every breath felt like I was inhaling shards of glass. I turned down an alley, thinking I could lose them, but the alley seemed endless. The walls closed in tighter and tighter, the narrow space becoming more oppressive with every step. I could still hear them, no, feel them following me, their presence a constant weight on my chest. The whispering was louder now, overlapping, no longer just a distant murmur but a cacophony of voices, each one saying something different, something maddening. I stumbled again. My foot caught on something soft and slick on the ground, and I fell forward, scraping my hands against the rough pavement. When I looked up, the alley had changed again. The walls, once lined with graffiti and peeling posters, were now smooth and featureless, stretching into an endless void. The lights above flickered one last time before they went out completely, leaving me in total darkness. "You can't escape." The voice was louder now, more distinct, and for the first time, I realized it wasn't just a whisper, it was in my head. It was inside me, clawing at my thoughts. The air grew colder, so cold that I could see my breath in front of me, like a fog. My pulse quickened, panic clawing at my chest. Then, something moved in the dark. I couldn't see it, but I felt it, a presence that was so close I could almost touch it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, my body paralyzed with fear. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. I couldn't move. And then, I felt it. A hand. Cold, clammy, but unmistakably real, resting on my shoulder. It was a touch, but it wasn't human. "You're not alone," the voice whispered, its breath like ice against my ear. I froze, the world around me spinning, my mind unraveling as I turned my head, slowly, too slowly, to look. But there was nothing there. No one. The alley was empty. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was there. Watching. Waiting. And it was getting closer. The alley was silent. Too silent. I stood frozen, heart hammering in my chest, eyes desperately scanning the darkness. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air biting into my skin, but there was no sound. The usual hum of the city was gone, swallowed whole by the night. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, as though the darkness had grown dense, closing in like a heavy curtain. That's when I realized it. The touch on my shoulder, that cold, clammy hand, it hadn't left. It was still there. It hadn't just been a passing sensation, a trick of the mind. No, it was real. I could feel the coldness seeping into my jacket, creeping under my skin. The hand wasn't just resting on my shoulder, it was gripping me. And slowly, steadily, it was pulling me backward, toward the void at the end of the alley. I tried to scream, but my voice was trapped, lodged somewhere deep in my throat. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground, each step forward a struggle, like I was wading through thick, invisible mud. I wanted to move, to run, to fight, but I couldn't. The pressure on my shoulder increased, as if whatever was behind me was dragging me toward it. I could feel the presence now. It was so close, so intimate, that it made my skin crawl. The whispers were back, louder this time, a chorus of soft, raspy voices that seemed to emanate from every direction. They weren't just words anymore, they were feelings, nauseating, suffocating emotions that surged through me. Fear, loneliness, despair. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was clear this time, the words sharp and biting. It echoed in my skull, vibrating through my bones. It was neither male nor female, but something other, something ancient and foreign that I couldn't comprehend. It knew me in a way that nothing should. I felt the crushing weight of its knowledge, the knowledge of every fear, every regret, every dark thought I had ever buried deep within myself. The cold hand on my shoulder tightened its grip. My knees buckled beneath me, and I fell to the ground, unable to break free from its hold. My heart raced, panic flooding every inch of my body. My pulse echoed in my ears, almost drowning out the whispers. "You can't escape, it's already too late." I blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog in my mind, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this real? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me in the dead of night? I reached out, my trembling fingers brushing against the cold pavement, desperate to push myself up. The shadows around me shifted again, stretching and twisting, becoming long, serpentine tendrils that coiled toward me, wrapping themselves around my legs, pulling me down further. My breath caught in my throat as I looked up, my eyes darting around in the dark. The alley was gone. The cityscape had shifted, contorted into something unrecognizable. The tall buildings that had once surrounded me were now twisted, their edges frayed like torn paper. The ground beneath me had turned soft, almost like sand, shifting with every movement I made. The air tasted like metal, like blood. I wasn't in the alley anymore. I wasn't even in the city. I had crossed over somehow, into a space where time and reality didn't work the way they were supposed to. "Welcome." The voice was all around me now, echoing in the very air I breathed. I looked up, and through the shifting darkness, I saw something. A shape. A figure, standing just beyond the reach of the feeble light that remained, its outline jagged and indistinct. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it seemed to loom over me like a shadow, stretching far beyond its natural form. It wasn't human. Not anymore. The figure moved slowly, but there was no sound, no scrape of feet on the ground, no shift of clothing. It was as though it existed in the spaces between sounds. The darkness itself seemed to grow and bend around it, wrapping itself around its limbs like a cloak. I tried to push myself up again, my hands slipping against the sand-like ground. It was no use. Every time I thought I had regained control, the presence tightened its grip on me, pulling me back, reminding me of its power. "You don't belong here." The figure's voice was like the rasp of dying leaves, brittle and dry, but its words pierced my mind. I knew that it was speaking directly to me, to the core of my being. I didn't belong here, wherever here was. I had trespassed into something I wasn't supposed to understand, something far darker than I could ever imagine. The figure took a step forward, and the shadows around it twisted violently, responding to its every movement. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending together into a single, overwhelming cacophony. "Now, you will stay." I could feel the weight of the words sinking into me, heavy and unyielding. I could feel the presence pressing against me, forcing me to stay. But deep down, a small, stubborn spark of resistance burned. No, I wouldn't stay. I couldn't. I fought against it, pushing against the sand beneath me, my hands scraping the ground, my fingers desperately clawing for something solid, something that could pull me back. And then, just as the figure reached for me, its shadowy fingers outstretched, something happened. A sharp crack, like thunder, rang through the air. The shadows recoiled. The presence faltered. I didn't know what it was, whether it was a sound, a force, or something else entirely, but for the first time, I felt a shift in the air. The grip on my shoulder loosened, and the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on me lifted, just slightly. I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. With everything I had, I pushed myself to my feet. And I ran. The world around me spun as I stumbled to my feet, disoriented and dizzy. My heart was still pounding like a drum in my chest, the pulse in my temples almost unbearable. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to look back. The dark figure behind me, it was still there, lurking just beyond my reach. I could feel its presence, like a cold wind brushing against the back of my neck, threatening to swallow me whole. I forced myself to move faster, pushing through the soft, shifting ground beneath me. The sand-like earth had become treacherous, and each step felt as if I were sinking deeper into the abyss. The shadows around me writhed, their tendrils reaching out like grasping hands. Every corner of this strange, nightmarish place seemed to be alive, its very existence an extension of the malevolent force chasing me. The figure, the stalker, wasn't following me in the traditional sense. It didn't need to. It was everywhere at once, surrounding me, closing in on all sides. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and chaotic. They weren't just voices, they were thoughts, slipping into my own mind, twisting my perception. I could feel my sanity slipping, unraveling, as the darkness gnawed at me from all angles. "You can't run." The voice came again, sharper this time, the words slicing through the panic in my mind. "You can't escape." I didn't know how much time had passed since I started running. Time didn't seem to work the same way here. The sky, if that's what it was, had no stars, no moon. It was just a sickly gray-black, swirling above me in a never-ending loop. The ground beneath me seemed to shift with each step, the lines of reality blurring like watercolors on paper. But I couldn't stop. I refused to stop. There was a faint light ahead, far in the distance, barely visible through the thick mist that clung to the air. I pushed myself harder, willing my legs to carry me faster. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to get to that light. It was the only thing that felt like salvation, the only thing that wasn't suffocating me with dread. I reached out, my hand trembling as I swiped at the thick fog, my fingers grazing against something cold and smooth. It was metal. A door. The light I had been running toward came from behind it, shining through a small crack in the otherwise solid surface. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the handle and wrenched the door open, half expecting it to snap off its hinges. The world behind me seemed to freeze, as if it were holding its breath. I tumbled through the doorway, slamming the door shut behind me with a force that rattled my bones. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Deep, oppressive silence. The air in this new place felt heavier, but the weight of the presence was gone, at least for the moment. I sat on the floor, breathing heavily, my hands pressed to the cold metal door as if it could somehow protect me from what lay beyond it. My mind was reeling, every thought spinning in a whirlwind of confusion and terror. Was I still dreaming? Had I crossed into some otherworldly plane? Or was this real? I didn't know how long I sat there, my back pressed against the door, listening for any sign of the creature following me. There was nothing, no whispers, no movement. But the silence felt wrong. Too still. As if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. Suddenly, there was a low creak from above me. My head snapped up, eyes darting to the ceiling. I could hear something now, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing down a corridor I couldn't see. The noise was growing closer, the sound of something heavy and unnatural approaching. It found me. I jumped to my feet, panic surging again, but this time there was nowhere to run. The door behind me was the only exit, and it was already too late to escape through it. I pressed my back against the cold metal wall, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My hands trembled uncontrollably. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something, but my body was frozen in fear. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then the voice came again, this time more distinct, more personal. I told you, you can't escape. I turned toward the voice, only to see a dark shape emerging from the mist in front of me. It wasn't the figure I had seen earlier. No, this was something new, something more insidious, as though the very darkness itself had taken shape. The creature was tall, impossibly tall, its body twisting and contorting as if it were made of shadow and smoke. Its form seemed to flicker, shifting in and out of focus like a glitch in reality. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were two black holes, infinite and empty, staring directly at me. I couldn't move. The fear was so intense that it felt like I had been paralyzed, my body trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. You belong here now. The words were like ice, freezing my very soul. Suddenly, the creature lunged forward, its long, twisted limbs stretching out like vines, reaching for me. The darkness wrapped around my body, pulling me into its grasp. I couldn't scream. I couldn't fight back. I felt myself being pulled into the abyss, into the void where reality ceased to exist. And then, just as my mind was slipping into oblivion, I heard a noise, an unnatural crack, a rift in the air, followed by the sound of rushing wind. Something was coming. Something was breaking through the darkness. No. No. Please. I fought with everything I had left, reaching out into the void for anything to hold on to. And then, just as my fingers brushed against something solid, something real, everything went dark. I don't know how much time passed before I woke. The air was still heavy, thick with the scent of metal and earth. My limbs were numb, and my body felt as though it had been pulled apart and put back together again. I tried to sit up, but my head spun, and a sharp pain shot through my skull. The world was different. Familiar, yet wrong. And that's when I saw it. The door I had fled through was gone. In its place was only a smooth wall, unbroken, untouched by time. But as I reached out to touch it, I felt the unmistakable presence behind me once more. Cold fingers, brushing lightly across my skin. You can't run forever. And that was when I realized this nightmare would never end. I felt my chest tighten, a suffocating pressure building around my ribs as the presence returned, creeping up behind me. The cold fingers, so light and insidious, were tracing their way down my spine, sending a shiver of dread through my entire body. The air felt heavier now, thick with the taste of something metallic and ancient. My fingers trembled as I touched the smooth surface of the wall, searching for something, anything, familiar, but there was nothing. I had no choice but to turn around. My body moved on its own, forced by an overwhelming sense of inevitability, as though something deep inside me understood that this was the moment of reckoning, the point of no return. When I turned, the creature was there, standing in the same place where I had last seen it. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just a flicker in the shadows, an amalgamation of darkness. No, it had taken form, solid, unyielding, its silhouette stretching unnaturally tall, as though it were a part of the very walls, the very space around me. Its face, if you could even call it that, was still nothing but a void, black, endless, swirling like a storm too violent to comprehend. And yet, despite the absence of any real features, I could feel it watching me, its gaze pressing into my soul. It was aware of every thought, every fear that had ever crossed my mind. I had become its prey, trapped in a nightmare that had no end. You cannot escape. The voice, familiar yet chilling, reverberated in my skull, deep and cold. You belong to the dark now. The words felt like a curse, binding me in place, freezing me to the ground. I couldn't look away from it, couldn't tear my gaze from those endless eyes, because I knew that whatever it was, whatever this thing was, it had the power to consume me entirely. It stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, as though savoring every moment. The shadows around it swirled with its every motion, and I felt the walls themselves pulse, a rhythmic, terrifying heartbeat that matched the pounding of my own chest. I couldn't move. My body felt like stone, frozen under the weight of its presence. A part of me wanted to scream, to fight, but there was no strength left in me. What could I do? How could I fight something that existed outside the realm of reason, outside the boundaries of the world I had known? I could hear the whispers again, louder now, echoing through my skull in a maddening crescendo. You can't fight it. You can't run from it. You're mine. The voices were coming from everywhere, inside my mind, inside the very air around me, filling the space until there was nothing left but the sound of their suffocating chant. My pulse raced, my vision blurred, and I felt myself slipping, losing my grip on reality. And then, just as it seemed like I was going to lose all sense of self, a thought pierced through the chaos, a thought that stood out against the noise, a thought of defiance. What if this isn't real? The thought hit me like a lightning bolt, a sudden spark of clarity amid the madness. What if the thing standing before me, the darkness that seemed to consume everything in its path, was not the true enemy? What if it was just a manifestation of my own fear, my own guilt, my own weaknesses? What if I was trapped not in a nightmare, but in my own mind? I couldn't be sure, but the thought gave me something, a sliver of hope, however faint it was. It gave me the strength to move. I staggered backward, still unable to tear my gaze away from the creature, but something in me shifted. Something clicked into place. The walls, the shadows, the very air seemed to bend around me as I pushed forward, my hands reaching for the space ahead. I didn't know if I was truly escaping or if this was just another trick, another layer of the nightmare. But I had to try. I took another step, then another, and with each one, the presence seemed to weaken, the shadows pulling back, as though they weren't entirely sure how to handle my defiance. I didn't care if it was real or imagined. I didn't care if this was my mind cracking open or if I was truly facing a force that could end me. I was not going to let it consume me. I ran, or at least, I tried to. My legs were shaking, my vision still distorted, but my resolve was growing stronger. I pushed myself forward, moving toward a flickering light in the distance. There was something real out there. There had to be. The darkness around me seemed to shudder, retreating as I fought back. The creature's voice howled in frustration, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I wasn't going to let it win. The light grew brighter as I pushed forward, and just as I reached it, the ground beneath me seemed to give way. The darkness snapped at my heels, but I leapt, throwing myself into the light. And for a moment, everything was silent. I don't know how long I floated in that silence. Time didn't make sense anymore. My mind was still racing, my heart still pounding, but the darkness, it was gone. I opened my eyes and found myself standing in an unfamiliar room. The walls were solid, real. The air was warm, safe. But as I looked around, I realized something horrifying. The light was too bright. The walls were too smooth, too perfect. There were no windows, no doors. I wasn't free. Not really. The darkness had followed me. I turned to face the wall, the pressure building once more. There was no escape from it now. It had taken hold of me completely. And that was when I understood. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was my reality. Have you ever felt like the cold wasn't just outside your body, but creeping into your very bones? As if the world itself was withdrawing its warmth from you, slowly suffocating you with the chill of something much deeper than winter? That's how it started for me, one seemingly ordinary winter evening, when the cold wasn't just something to be bundled up against. It was something more. I was walking home after work, the streets bathed in the faint yellow glow of the streetlights, the air sharp with the bite of the season. The world felt muffled, like it had been wrapped in a heavy blanket of snow. Every step I took seemed to sink into the icy ground, the world around me eerily quiet, save for the soft crunch of my boots. The walk should have been peaceful, routine, a simple end to an uneventful day. But as I moved, something shifted in the air. It wasn't immediately obvious, but there was a subtle change, a kind of heaviness, a presence in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. At first, I thought it was the cold, the winter chill that always seems to creep in when you least expect it, but this was different. This was wrong. I paused at the corner, adjusting my coat against the wind, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The quiet of the night, the peaceful stillness, suddenly felt oppressive. My breath formed small clouds in the cold air, the steam rising to meet the night, but there was something strange about it, something off about how it lingered. It hung there too long, almost like it was waiting. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was just the cold, the winter, making everything seem eerie. But the further I walked, the heavier the air became. The darkness seemed to grow, to deepen. I started hearing things, small noises, distant sounds. A faint rustling that wasn't the wind. Footsteps? No. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. Just the empty street, the stillness of the night. Yet, the feeling remained, someone, or something, was watching me. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this way. I've always been a bit jumpy, especially at night. A product of too many horror stories as a kid, I guess. But tonight was different. This wasn't just the usual paranoia. There was a weight to the air that felt suffocating. I quickened my pace, pulling my coat tighter around me. The path ahead was empty, stretching out into the cold distance, but there was a sense of something lurking just beyond my sight. My mind started to play tricks on me, shadows shifting in the corners of my vision, the faintest creak of branches swaying in the wind, though the trees around me were bare, stripped of their leaves by the harsh winter. And then it happened. A sudden, sharp gust of wind tore through the street, biting deep into my skin, as though the wind itself had a life of its own. But it wasn't just the wind. No. This cold, it felt different. It wasn't like the usual chill that clung to your skin and made you shiver. It felt like something was inside me, spreading through my chest, making my bones ache. A deep, unrelenting cold that seemed to go beyond the physical, beyond the winter. It was as if life itself was slowly draining out of me, bit by bit. A cold so intense, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I paused again, looking around, my heart pounding now, and that's when I saw it. Or rather, I felt it. The air around me seemed to shimmer for a second, like the world itself was bending. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the empty street, the darkness now feeling less like a natural absence and more like a presence. A black void that seemed to be watching me, waiting for something. And that's when I realized it wasn't just the cold. It was something else. Something more. A presence that was there, just on the edge of my perception, like a shadow that wasn't quite right. It wasn't in my head either. I knew that. The way the world seemed to pulse with this pressure, this coldness, was too real. Too physical. The hairs on my arms stood up as I took a step backward. My mind was racing. I was losing my grip on reality, my thoughts slipping into panic. Was it just the cold? Was it exhaustion? Or was there something else here, something I couldn't explain? I turned to keep walking, my steps now erratic, my breath shallow. But as I did, I heard it, a low, creaking sound like wood bending under pressure. I froze. The sound wasn't from the trees, nor the buildings around me. It came from the street, from the very air itself. I glanced around, desperate to see if anyone was near, but the street was empty. It felt like a dream, like I was walking through a nightmare, and I was no longer in control. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears now, the sound too loud, too fast. Every step I took felt like it was getting harder. The cold seeped deeper, sinking into my very soul. And then, just as I thought I might break under the pressure, a voice broke the silence. Soft. Whispering. You can feel it, can't you? My breath hitched. I spun around, my heart thumping in my chest. No one was there. But I knew I was not alone. The cold was not just the air. It was something else. And it was closing in. I stood there, frozen in place, heart hammering in my chest. My breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, visible in the frigid air. The voice, soft, almost soothing, had come from nowhere. My skin crawled as I strained my ears, trying to catch any other sound. But there was nothing. Only the wind, the whisper of snow, the rustling of dead leaves in the distance. Still, the sense of being watched remained, like a pressure I couldn't escape. I glanced around again, feeling the pulse of the world, the cold, seeping deeper into my skin. The street seemed to stretch forever, and yet it felt too close. Too claustrophobic. A slow, creeping sensation started at the back of my neck and crawled down my spine. I wasn't alone. I could feel it in my bones. The whisper lingered, a faint, guttural hum just beneath the surface of my thoughts. My mind screamed to ignore it, to dismiss it as nothing more than the tricks of a tired brain. But I knew that wasn't true. There was something wrong. Something off. The air was wrong. The darkness wasn't just absence, it was alive. It had weight, substance. I took a hesitant step forward, trying to shake off the icy grip that held my chest tight. The road ahead looked the same as always, empty, silent, swallowed by the night. But now it felt foreign, distorted. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too long. Every rustling sound felt like a footstep. I wasn't sure which way to go, which direction was safe, if any. I started walking again, my pace quickening, almost stumbling. My footsteps were louder now, almost echoing, as if the very ground beneath me was amplifying them. I could still feel that cold, suffocating sensation creeping beneath my ribs, into my chest. It was as if the cold was more than a temperature. It was a presence, pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. I had to get home. That was the only thought in my mind. I couldn't stay out here. Not in this presence that seemed to surround me. I turned down the next street, hoping that the change of scenery might help, that it might bring me some sense of normalcy, but the moment I did, the feeling intensified. The whisper came again, louder this time, like it was right behind me, breathing down my neck. "You're not alone, not anymore." I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. I saw nothing. No one. The street was still empty, the houses just dark silhouettes against the night sky. But the air around me had shifted, warped, somehow. The shadows seemed deeper now, the darkness thicker. It felt alive, like it was moving, shifting around me. I backed up a few steps, panic clawing at my chest. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. This was something real. Something other. The cold was no longer just outside, it was inside me, it was part of me, spreading into every inch of my body. I had to get out of there. I turned, running now, my breath coming out in short, frantic bursts. But the moment I started running, the whispers followed. They were no longer soft, they were clear, sharp. "Run all you want. It won't save you." My feet stumbled over the icy pavement as I rushed forward, my mind screaming at me to stop, to think, but I couldn't. The cold, the fear, the voices, everything was closing in on me. The houses, the streetlights, they were blurring now, everything around me becoming a haze. "Just make it home, just make it home," I told myself over and over. But then, the voice, it wasn't in my head anymore. It was physical. It was in the air, the cold. It felt like it was inside my skin. "You're already home." I froze. That was it. The realization hit me like a freight train. The world around me, the street, the houses, the sidewalk, it had all changed. This was no longer the place I had walked every day. It was distorted, fractured, like a dream. My feet didn't feel like they were touching the ground anymore. The icy grip that had settled on my chest was a part of this place now. This cold, this presence, it had followed me. It wasn't the streets that were haunted. It was me. I looked around, but nothing was the same. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting shadows that seemed to twist and writhe as though alive. The air felt thicker now, colder, suffocating. The buildings around me loomed larger, their windows dark, their edges sharp, like jagged teeth waiting to snap shut. There was no escape. No path out. "You're already home." The voice was in my mind again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was clear. It was real. I turned slowly, dread washing over me like a tidal wave. Standing at the end of the street, just beyond the reach of the nearest streetlight, was a figure. Tall. Dark. It was waiting. I couldn't make out any features, but I knew. I felt it in my bones. The cold. The presence. It wasn't just in the air. It was there. And it was waiting for me. I took a step back, my legs trembling beneath me. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The cold was unbearable now, and I could feel it closing in from all sides. Then, as if it had always been there, the figure stepped forward into the dim light. It was human, but not. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it didn't belong to this world. It was the thing in the shadows, the thing I had felt. I didn't know whether to run or face it, but one thing was certain, I couldn't escape. Not from this. Not from the cold. Not from whatever this was. The figure didn't move, not at first. It stood there, unmoving, just outside the pool of light from the street lamp. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, pulsing faster and faster. Sweat mixed with the freezing cold that bit at my skin. The cold, it was unbearable now, like it was reaching inside me, touching places no chill should ever reach. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath, but my mind was spinning. Was I dreaming? Had the cold finally gotten to me? I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The world around me felt like a dream, distorted and half-formed, and the figure standing in front of me was both terrifying and incomprehensible. It was too quiet, too still. And yet, the longer I stared at it, the more I realized, whatever this thing was, it was waiting for me. Not just for my next move, but for something deeper, something more personal. It was waiting for me to break. I could feel its gaze, even though I couldn't see its face. The cold seemed to emanate from it, creeping into every fiber of my being, making my bones ache. I wanted to scream, to run, but the words wouldn't come. My legs felt like they were made of stone, anchored to the ground by something invisible. My body refused to obey my mind. And then, in a flash, it moved. Faster than I could process, it lunged at me. Its limbs were impossibly long, distorting in ways they shouldn't have. The streetlight flickered once, twice, and in the brief gaps of darkness, it was right on me, its form shifting like smoke and shadow. The air around me cracked with the sound of something snapping, as if reality itself was splintering. I was running before I even knew I was moving. My body finally kicked into gear, my legs pushing me forward as fast as they could, but the cold was everywhere. It pressed down on me like hands on my chest, squeezing out all the air from my lungs. The whispering voice returned, louder now, swirling around my head. Run. You won't escape. I had no choice but to push on, my feet slamming against the frozen pavement, desperate to put distance between myself and the creature behind me. But no matter how fast I ran, it was always there, just behind me. A shadow that stretched unnaturally long, whispering my name. You can't run forever. I dared a quick glance over my shoulder, but it was gone. The street behind me was empty, but for the frost hanging in the air. For a brief, hopeful moment, I thought maybe I had outrun it. Maybe this was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was safe. But then the temperature dropped even further, if that was possible. The air turned thick, like I was breathing in ice, and I could feel my muscles tightening, slowing. The whispering voice was louder now, clearer. You'll never outrun me. And then I saw it, its silhouette emerging from the shadows up ahead. It was standing there, blocking the street, waiting for me. It didn't move, but I could feel it. The tension in the air was unbearable. It was playing with me. I tried to stop myself, but my feet kept carrying me forward. There was no way to stop. I could feel my legs giving out, my body shaking uncontrollably from the freezing cold that wasn't just external anymore. It was inside me. It was a part of me now. Come closer, the voice purred, its tone sweet, but suffocating. I tried to scream, but the sound was lost, swallowed by the cold. My teeth chattered, but I couldn't speak. The figure began to move again, slow, deliberate steps toward me, as if it were savoring my terror. I knew that I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't escape it. My only option was to face it. The street was narrowing, the shadows pressing in on all sides, choking the life out of the air around me. I stopped, my chest heaving with the effort of breathing, trying to steady myself. The figure was closer now, just beyond the range of the streetlight. Its shape was clearer, but still shifting, its features a blur of jagged edges and unnatural angles. For the first time, I saw its face, or at least, what I thought was a face. It was pale, almost translucent, with black pits where eyes should have been. Its mouth stretched open impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, glistening in the dim light. I stumbled back, fear flooding my system like a poison, but it was too late. The thing was already there, standing in front of me, blocking any chance of escape. The cold wrapped around me, tighter, colder than anything I had ever felt. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was suffocating, drowning me in a deep, empty abyss. And then it spoke again. "You are mine." I closed my eyes, the words echoing in my mind. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. This was some kind of nightmare. My eyes snapped open again, desperate to find some escape, but there was none. No way out. The cold had me in its grip, and I could feel the creature's presence all around me. But then, the whisper stopped. For a split second, everything was silent. Then, there was a sound. A cracking noise, like ice splitting. And just like that, the creature was gone. The weight that had crushed my chest lifted, and I could breathe again. But the chill remained, lingering in the air, in my bones. I stood there, gasping for air, heart still pounding, not daring to look around. Had it gone? Or was it just waiting? Suddenly, I heard it again, the soft, distant echo of its voice. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a laugh. Low, rumbling, and utterly devoid of any warmth. "I'll be back." And then, nothing. The silence was deafening. I took a shaky step back, and then another, unable to take my eyes off the spot where the creature had been just moments before. Was it gone? Was it real? My mind reeled, unable to grasp anything solid. I didn't know. But I couldn't stay here. With trembling hands, I turned and fled once more, not looking back. The shadows loomed behind me, but I couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. I couldn't afford to stop at all. I ran. I didn't stop. My legs ached, my chest burned with each ragged breath, but the fear pushed me forward. The streets seemed endless, the frozen ground beneath me feeling like it was swallowing me whole with every step. The cold was relentless, seeping through every layer of clothing, sinking deep into my skin. It wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside me, crawling through my veins, numbing everything it touched. I had to keep going. I had to get away. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the empty streets, too loud, too unnatural. My heart was pounding in my ears, drowning out any other noise, but I knew it wasn't just me anymore. I wasn't alone. I turned a corner, my feet slipping on the ice, and suddenly, it was there. It appeared out of nowhere, blocking the narrow alley ahead of me, its silhouette looming in the darkness. I froze. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel it. I could feel the cold coming off it, sharp like a blade. The air around me felt suffocating. The world around me began to distort again, like it was bending, warping, as if reality itself was breaking apart. "Run." The voice echoed in my mind, a low growl that crawled under my skin. But the creature didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. Waiting. I could feel the cold on my skin, deeper now, more intimate. It wasn't just a physical chill. It felt like it was eating at my very soul. I had never felt so exposed, so utterly vulnerable. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to turn and run, to flee from this thing that wasn't even human. I started backing away slowly, one foot after the other, my eyes never leaving the shadow that had become my nightmare. But it followed. It moved. And with each step, it seemed to shrink the distance between us. I could hear it now, slow, deliberate steps, like the crunch of snow underfoot. But there was no snow here. Just empty pavement, slick with ice. Yet, I could hear it. The unmistakable sound of something closing in. My breath hitched, panic seizing me in an iron grip. My feet moved faster now, the ground beneath me a blur as I sprinted through the alley, the creature's cold presence pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't escape it. No matter how fast I ran, no matter where I turned, it was there, just behind me, always just behind me. I stumbled again, my foot catching on the ice, and I crashed to the ground with a sharp gasp. My hands scraped against the cold pavement, but I couldn't feel them. The sensation was slipping away, just like everything else. The world was dimming at the edges, as if the darkness was consuming the very light. I struggled to my feet, but as I stood, I felt the cold around me, pressing against me, squeezing the air from my lungs. I wasn't just being chased anymore. It was as though the very space itself had turned against me. The walls of the alley seemed to close in, pushing me toward the thing I feared most. I turned. But this time, it wasn't the creature I saw. It was a man. A person. Or something that looked like a person, but there was something wrong with him. He was standing in the middle of the alley, his face obscured by the shadows. His outline was blurry, shifting like the fog that clung to the air around him. But there was no mistaking the cold. The cold coming off him was the same. "Are you lost?" His voice was deep, too deep, like it was coming from everywhere at once. His words sliced through the air, and I could feel them sinking into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The cold was overwhelming now, each breath a struggle against an invisible force. My mind was swimming in confusion, in terror. What was happening? Was this real? I took a step back, then another, not knowing what to do. This was wrong. All of it. He took a step forward. "You're not escaping," he said, his voice chillingly calm. And then, with a sudden shift, the shadows around him seemed to twist, to move. I blinked. And then everything went dark. I awoke lying on the cold ground, my body shaking uncontrollably. For a moment, I thought I was dead. I couldn't feel anything, just numbness, as if I were drifting in a void. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, stiff. And then I heard it. A low, grinding sound, like metal scraping against stone. I forced myself to sit up, my vision blurry, and I looked around. I was no longer in the alley. I was in a place I didn't recognize. It was dark, far darker than it should have been. The walls around me were crumbling, like an abandoned building. The air smelled damp, like mildew and decay. But there was something else. The cold. It was everywhere. I stood up, my legs wobbling beneath me, and I tried to steady myself. The space around me seemed to stretch and shift, like the very architecture of the place was warping, bending in impossible ways. In the distance, I saw it. The same shadow, the same cold figure, now standing in front of me. Its outline was clearer now, more defined, and I could see the jagged edges of its form. But what struck me most was its eyes, or the absence of them. There were only dark, hollow sockets where eyes should have been, and I could feel them boring into me, stripping me of everything I had left. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me was empty, silent. "You can't run anymore," the voice echoed, and I felt the cold closer than ever before. I tried to move, but the shadows gripped me, pulling me toward it. I could feel its icy fingers closing around my throat, tightening. It wasn't just a chase anymore. This was the end. And then I realized, with a sickening twist in my gut, that there was nowhere to run. I was already gone. I gasped for air, but none came. The cold was suffocating me, curling into my lungs like ice, filling my chest with weight that I could never escape. I tried to scream, but my mouth was frozen shut, the air thick with a freezing presence. Every movement felt sluggish, as if the shadows themselves were binding me in place. I blinked, desperately trying to focus, to make sense of this place, but everything was a blur. The walls, the floor, everything shifted, warping and bending in a way that no physical space should. The edges of reality felt like they were crumbling, and I was trapped inside a nightmare that had no end. The figure, it stood before me, taller than anything human, its shape flickering like a flame in the wind. The cold, unnatural chill emanating from it seemed to distort the very air around me, twisting it into shapes that made no sense. I tried to step back, but my legs refused to obey. My body was paralyzed, my skin crawling under the relentless touch of the freezing darkness. "You can't escape," the voice said again, its tone like a funeral bell, deep and echoing in the hollow space around me. The words wrapped around my mind, constricting it until I couldn't think clearly anymore. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even feel like I was alive. All I knew was the cold, its relentless, suffocating grip on me. Suddenly, there was a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible noise, like the rustle of leaves in a far-off wind. But it wasn't leaves. It was something else. Something worse. My gaze shifted, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The darkness was alive. It moved and twisted, far too much for it to be just shadows. The ground beneath me seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, the space breathing in time with an unholy presence. The walls stretched and contracted, closing in on me, as if the very building wanted to consume me. "Please," I tried to whisper, the words barely escaping my throat. But even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't going to matter. There was no escaping this. I could feel it now, the pressure in the air, like something was pulling at me, dragging me deeper into the abyss. My chest tightened, and I felt my heart beating harder, faster, faster than it should have. It was as if time itself was warping, dragging me along with it. Then I saw it. The figure moved again, not just in front of me, but inside me, like it was reaching into my soul, pulling something out. Its hands, if they could even be called that, reached for me, fingers too long, too thin, stretching like claws toward my throat. I could hear the sound of its movement, an almost dry rustling, as if it were made of paper or brittle bone. It was so close now that I could feel the void in its presence, the emptiness that seemed to hunger for everything, everything I was. The darkness surrounded me, pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. The cold wrapped tighter, deeper, until I could no longer tell where it ended and I began. Then, it whispered, "Asterisk, this is where it ends." I tried to break free, my body shaking violently, but it was no use. There was nothing left for me to fight. It was like my entire being was being erased, piece by piece, consumed by the void. There was no escaping it now. No turning back. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But the cold had taken everything. My strength, my will, my breath, everything was slipping away, as though it had never belonged to me in the first place. The darkness pressed in around me, suffocating every inch of reality, until all I could feel was the emptiness, the absence of everything I knew. The cold had taken everything. And in that moment, I understood. This was not just death. It was the end. The end of everything. The end of the world I had known, the end of time, the end of my life, the end of all meaning. It was an erasure that went deeper than death, beyond the physical. In the final seconds, the figure seemed to dissolve into the darkness, its outline breaking apart, scattering like sand in the wind. The cold didn't leave, but I felt lighter. As if something had lifted from me, even as everything else was taken. I didn't know where I was anymore. I didn't know if I was still alive. But all that remained was the quiet. And the cold. The cold that would never leave. And with that, everything faded away. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.